In this lesson, we'll begin working with the 3ds Max Material Editor. Right, so to open up the Material Editor within 3ds Max, all we have to do is go up to this top toolbar, and right next to the icon for Render Setup, you should see an icon for the Material Editor. Now, depending on which version of Max you happen to be using, you may get something very, very different whenever you click on this icon. So, if you're using anything that is 3ds Max 2011 or newer, by default, the Material Editor is set to the new Slate Material Editor. Now, this is a feature that was introduced in 3ds Max 2011. Now, if you're using anything older than 2011, you will have what's now referred to as the Compact Material Editor, which previous versions of Max just simply referred to this as the Material Editor, since the Slate feature does not exist in anything that is older than 2011. Right, so for the next couple of lessons, we're going to be working on the Compact Material Editor, and then we'll take a little bit of time in one of our later lessons to talk about the Slate Material Editor. All right, so a lot of users actually find this Material Editor to be a little bit confusing the first time they open it. And one of the main points of confusion is that the first time you open this, we really don't see any of the materials within our scene. Everything is just sort of this gray sphere. So what we have to keep in mind whenever working with this Material Editor is that these different spheres do not actually represent the materials themselves. All that we're doing is basically, these are essentially just little preview thumbnails. So we can load up any kind of a material within this thumbnail and preview it within these editing areas. So let's come in and just start to learn how we can take some of our materials within the scene and begin loading them up into this Material Editor. So let's select one of the preview thumbnails. So let's say we want to take our orange material and load it up into this particular preview thumbnail. So with this one selected, let's go down to this eyedropper tool, which will pick the object from any material that we click on. You can see my cursor changes, and so now I'm going to bring this right over my orange sphere, click on that, and now this material has been loaded up within this particular swatch, or this slot, as 3ds Max calls it. Okay, so now let's choose another one of these slots. Let's go to this one right next to it, and let's try to load up this material that we're using right now as our floor. So again, we'll go back to the eyedropper tool, click on the floor, and now this material's been loaded up in this preview slot. Now you'll notice that both of these materials have in each corner this little triangle. So what this is indicating is that this particular material slot is representing a material that is being used somewhere in this scene. You'll notice all of these other materials that we have, none of them have that same little triangle in each corner, so that means that none of these materials are being used anywhere in the scene. As soon as I were to take any of these and let's say drop these onto one of our objects, you can see that now inherits these little triangles, which means that something in our scene is using that material. Now if I click on an object, you'll notice that now these triangles turn kind of a bright white color. That means that whatever object I currently have selected is using this material. So if I were to go in and select the floor, you can see the same thing happens. Alright, now I'm going to reiterate that the most important aspect of this Material Editor to keep in mind is that these little preview swatches that we're currently looking at do not represent the materials themselves. Instead, all we're looking at is whatever material we happen to have loaded up in this particular slot at this point in time. So if I had this particular slot active, and if I were to come in and sample this orange material again off of this sphere, you'll notice that now this checkerboard material that we had in here previously is now overridden by this orange material. Now that does not mean that we've replaced the material in our scene. All that we've done is now loaded up a different material within this particular preview slot. Right? But a situation like this shows where these little corner indicators become really, really important. Now that I've sampled this material again, you'll notice that it actually makes a duplicate of this material. Now this one that we previously had active, you'll notice that it no longer has these triangles on it, which means that this particular material preview slot does not represent a material that's currently being used in the scene. Instead, that active material has been loaded up in here. Right? So now if I wanted to go back over here, and again just use the eyedropper tool, let's sample another one. Now again, you can see we have not necessarily overridden the orange material. We're just now looking at a different material in this preview slot. Right? Now, what if we actually did want to make a new material altogether? Maybe something that is sort of a blue or a green material. Well, all we have to do is take one of these empty material slots, click on that, and you can see that immediately we have access to a lot of very basic attributes. And this is what 3ds Max refers to as its default material, or its standard material. So let's say I were to come in here, choose the diffuse color, which is basically the surface color of our material, and maybe give this a little bit more of a blue color. There we go. We can also come in and start to introduce maybe a little bit more of a specular highlight onto this. Maybe tighten that specular highlight up a little bit more. And now all we have to do is take this new material, click, and drop it onto whatever object that we want. Now you notice, again, these little triangle indicators will light up, meaning that this material is now being used somewhere in our scene. Now we can come in here and actually give this a name, because right now it's just set to 07 default, which really doesn't mean much to us if we're looking for a name. So let's make sure that we give this something that is a little bit more indicative of what we have here. So we'll call this blue material. And there we go. All right, now this is going to be good if we have, again, just a very, very basic material with very basic needs. But there may also be certain circumstances where we need that is maybe something a little bit more advanced, where we want to get into very realistic glass or realistic metals, things like that. Now in that case, we could actually choose to use something other than the 3ds Max standard material, which again is what is by default currently loaded up in all of these little preview slots. So if we wanted to use a completely different material, just select the preview slot, and now choose standard, which is currently the material type that we're using. And now this will pull open the material and map browser. And now we can actually choose a completely different material type to load up in this preview slot. So what we're looking at right now are the standard 3ds Max materials. Now these are all going to be used within the scanline renderer, and all of these are completely compatible with MentalRay as well. Now, if we have MentalRay actually loaded up as our plugin, so if we go back to the render setup, you'll notice that we are using the default scanline render right now. So if I go back and make sure that I do have MentalRay loaded up, once we do have MentalRay active, we should now have a whole bunch of new materials to be able to choose from. So again, back in the material editor, let's go back to standard. And now you can see that we have a whole bunch of additional MentalRay materials to be able to choose from. And again, depending on which version of 3ds Max you're using, you may find a completely different list here, because this list does change and get updated as 3ds Max gets updated as well. So if we were to drop on something like, maybe a solid glass, let's just select that, press OK, and now you can see within this preview slot we now have a completely different list of parameters to be able to work with. All right, so if we were to take this and let's say drop this onto the sphere in front, let's actually undo that, press Ctrl Z, maybe pull it onto the sphere that's in the front in our perspective view. All right, and let's re-render again, press Shift Q. All right, and there we go. So anytime we're going to be using any of these specialized 3ds Max shaders for MentalRay, you have to keep in mind that these will only render whenever we're using MentalRay as our rendering engine. These types of materials that are exclusive to MentalRay will actually not be able to be rendered within the scanline render. So this is sort of what we were alluding to in one of our earlier lessons dealing with the active shade. So if I have any materials in my scene that are specific to MentalRay, you'll notice if we try to now switch this to the active shade, which is all the way down at the bottom of my menu here, you'll notice that these types of materials that are unique to MentalRay do not get rendered within the active shade. Right? And we'll have the exact same problem if we try to render these types of materials within the default scanline render. All right, so anytime we want to get back to the material editor, we can again just go back to the material editor icon, or you can use the keyboard shortcut, which is M on your keyboard. And that's actually the method that I prefer to use as far as getting back into the material editor. All right, so that's just a very, very basic overview of the 3ds Max material editor. In our next lesson, we're going to take a look at some slightly more advanced features that can be found within this condensed material editor.